Statements from the host and guests is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. On this special edition of Talk Legal, my guest will be the legendary prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi. Vince was the man that put Charles Manson behind bars in 1971 for the Tate LaBianca murders, and he subsequently wrote the all-time best-selling true crime book, Helter Skelter, which chronicled the crimes and trial of the Manson family. Vince went on to write a number of best-selling true crime books covering topics like the JFK assassination, as well as the O.J. Simpson trial. His career as a prosecutor is nothing less than legendary. He has tried 106 felony jury trials and secured convictions in 105 of them. That's a 99.1% conviction rate. He tried 21 murder cases and secured convictions in all of them. This evening, we're going to be discussing his book, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder, as well as a DVD with a slightly different title that's called The Prosecution of an American President. And in it, Vince discusses the possible prosecution of George W. Bush for taking us to war in Iraq. This film runs an hour and 41 minutes. I could have easily watched another hour or two. It was truly that compelling. It is a really eye-opening film. I highly endorse it, and it's a great view for both attorneys and non-attorneys alike. So I'd like to, without further ado, introduce Vincent Bugliosi to the show. Vince, can you hear me?
Yes, Jeff. Thank you so much for those kind words. You know, I met my wife probably before you were born in Coral Gables. Well, in Miami, Florida. I was going to the University of Miami in Coral Gables close to 60 years ago. So I have a connection with South Florida. Thank you for inviting me on your show, Jeff. My new DVD, as you mentioned, The Prosecution of an American President, is based on my book, The Prosecution of George W. Bush for Murder. That's a book, by the way, that was blacked out by the mainstream media and yet became a bestseller. In fact, the New York Times wrote an article, not about the book per se, but it was a big article about the fact, they said, how is this book a New York Times bestseller when it's being blacked out? It was being blacked out because everyone was just frightened of taking on George Bush. Well, I do have a certain following, not a big following, but there was word of mouth, and I was getting on some alternative media. Anyway, the DVD is just out now, and it's based on that book, and some new things, most importantly on President Obama. But before I get into the evidence against Bush, Jeff, there's a couple things that I think the American media now are just completely overlooking. So before I get into the fact that Bush took this nation to war in Iraq on a lie and under false pretenses, and therefore under the law is guilty of murder for the deaths of 4,500 American soldiers who died fighting his war in Iraq, I do want to get into these 2 points that, to my knowledge, are being greatly overlooked, maybe completely overlooked by the media. Number one, and let's make this clear, George Bush is responsible for the existence of ISIS. We all know what ISIS is. They've been terrorizing the Mideast and literally sending chills through the bodies of everyone else in the civilized world. Where do you think these barbarians came from? Well, I'll tell you where they came from. They were members of a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now, that's the Al-Qaeda group that came to Iraq, Jeff, in 2003, right after Bush invaded the country. They came there to fight the American forces. So there was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq and no ISIS before Bush invaded Iraq. So ISIS later became a they call it a breakaway faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, although what I've heard, I hate to inject any humor to this thing, but apparently they were so bad, so fanatic, and so brutal that even Al-Qaeda couldn't take them and booted them out. Now, how bad do you have to be for Al-Qaeda to boot you out? So Bush is not only responsible, Jeff, for the deaths of 4,500 American soldiers, and approximately, this number has fluctuated, but now the common consensus seems to be around 500,000 innocent Iraqi men, women, children, and babies who died terrible deaths during the Iraqi war. But he's also responsible for all the unspeakable atrocities being committed today by ISIS. George Bush gave birth to ISIS.
And wouldn't you agree also, Vince, that ISIS really shows a contrast to the way things were under the Saddam Hussein regime, which is totally secular?
I'll get into that shortly. Yeah, no, absolutely, a tremendous contrast. My question is, why? Of course, I'm talking about that, but no one pays any attention to me. But why isn't this on the cover of Time magazine, Jeff? Why isn't this a lead editorial for the New York Times? What we do here, Jeff, is that Bush has been fascinated with the lovely pastime of painting. He's become fascinated with it. That his popularity, once was very low, as you know, has now gone up, and he's now higher in the popularity polls than President Obama. And according to the New York Times, friends of Bush, according to an article in the New York Times, say they've never seen George Bush happier. And we'll get into the other thing that you said right now. You brought up a very good point. What's going on in Iraq now, all the chaos and the horror, totally different from under Saddam Hussein. We know the carnage and the violence going on in Iraq today. The second thing I want to say, and you've alluded to it, why isn't anyone pointing out the fact that prior to Bush's invasion, Iraq, under Hussein, was actually a very peaceful nation, 10 times more peaceful than the United States of America. The crime rate was very low. The Sunnis and Shiites were getting along. They probably hated each other, but they weren't fighting with each other. Today, they're slaughtering each other. Yes, Hussein was a brutal dictator who would not tolerate dissent. But as far as I know, Jeff, now maybe you've heard to the contrary, and if you have, I'd like to hear it. As far as I know, and I've been very attentive to this issue, if you minded your own business in Iraq and didn't try to overthrow Hussein like the Shiites did after the Persian Gulf War in 1991, you could just about, according to what I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, just about do whatever you wanted to do in Iraq. For instance, there was freedom of religion. If you were a Christian, you worshipped in a Christian church. Now, Christian churches are being burned to the ground, and Christians, if they're lucky, they're getting the option of becoming a Muslim or being murdered. If you were gay, you didn't have to hide your sexual orientation. You went to a gay bar at night. If you were a woman, under Hussein's Iraq, you were not discriminated against. You could go to the finest university, or one of the finest in the Mideast, University of Baghdad, become a doctor, a lawyer, whatever you wanted to be. And once you became a doctor or lawyer, you went to work in a dress, not a burqa, and you had a cell phone. Baghdad was being compared to a modern-day Dallas, Texas. So Bush invaded Iraq with his outrageous fraudulent war, Jeff, and virtually destroyed the entire nation, as well as killing over 500,000 people. Yet he is still walking free among us. He's gotten away with murder. The horror he's caused is incalculable. The hell on earth over there today, the cry, the rivers of blood, the screams, the incredible suffering he caused, and this despicable, because that's what he is, he's a despicable human being. When they ask him, Jeff, on some of the morning Sunday shows, well, how do you feel about what you did in Iraq? These are his exact words. I have no regrets. Unbelievable. Do you want to talk about anything that I've already talked about before I get into the evidence?
I was just following up on your point about Saddam. The analogy with him that I've always heard is that he was almost like a mob boss that was sort of drunk on power, and really Muslim or Islamic fanaticism really had nothing to do with it.
Right. He did have a son that indiscriminately killed one or two people, but look what he did with the son. He excommunicated him, or whatever the word is. He sent him to Switzerland for about 5 years. Getting into the evidence, Bush told two main lies to the American people, quite apart from the issue of weapons of mass destruction, which I can discuss separately, but that really was not the main issue. That was a sub-issue. The main lie he told is that because of these so-called weapons of mass destruction, which we found out Iraq did not have, Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country. That's the first lie that George Bush told. The second lie is that he led the American people, Jeff, to believe that Hussein was involved in 9/11, and we know it never happened. The 9/11 Commission, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and many other people have investigated this entire matter and didn't find one single speck of evidence that Hussein had anything to do with 9/11. Now, here I'm going to get into the evidence. I'm not going to cover everything. There'd be no reason to watch the DVD if you know the whole thing. But I'm going to get into some of the main points.
Before you do that, Vince, I just wanted to ask if you could just clarify your legal theory under which Bush is guilty of murder. Essentially what you're saying is that because he went to war on a lie that there was no imminent threat, no justification, therefore the killings were unlawful, and because he knew people would die, that it was premeditated and therefore first-degree murder. Is that a more or less a summary of your points?
Yeah. Well, it's a can of worms, but I've looked into the whole thing and wrote out in depth all the legal arguments. But I can tell you, if we get into that, we're going to be talking for an hour.
Right.
But the main issue, the main overriding issue, if he were ever prosecuted, is did he or did he not act in self-defense? That's the main. Now, there are many subsidiary issues, but that's the main issue. Did he or did he not act in self-defense? If it turns out, if he were tried, that he acted in self-defense, that he thought Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, and that's why he went to war, then the killings in Iraq would not be unlawful. They'd be lawful killings, killing during wartime. But if it turned out that he did not act in self-defense and took the nation to war on a lie, as you say, then all the killings in Iraq of American soldiers would be unlawful killings and therefore murder. But I'm glad you brought that point on. But to get into some of the more sophisticated legal issues, it would take a great amount of time and be probably inappropriate for a lay audience. But at the bottom, I can guarantee you, the bottom issue, self-defense. Did he act in self-defense or not? Now, with respect to the first lie that I alluded to earlier, on October the 1st, 2002, the CIA sent to the White House its classified, top-secret national intelligence estimate report on Iraq. The report was a consensus of all 16 federal intelligence agencies. I don't even remember the names of all of them, but certainly the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Defense Intelligence Agency. But there's 16, and the main one, of course, is the CIA. Page 8 of the report clearly says Iraq, this is the consensus now of all these intelligence agencies, Iraq was not an imminent threat to the security of this country. Yet unbelievably, and there's no other word I can use, Jeff, just 6 days later, on October the 7th, in Bush's first televised speech to the nation on the alleged Iraqi threat from Cincinnati, he told millions of unsuspecting Americans the exact opposite of what his own CIA was telling him. Bush said that Hussein was, quote, a great danger to our nation, unquote, either by his attacking us with his weapons of mass destruction or giving his WMD to some terrorist group to do so. He said this could happen, quote, on any given day, unquote. In other words, the threat was imminent. Now, going back to these dates again, the dates are very important here. The classified NIE, National Intelligence Estimate Report, as I said, was on October the 1st, 2002. On October the 4th, 3 days later, the Bush administration issued an unclassified version of this report, one that came to be called the White Paper, and it went to Congress and the American people. Now, October the 4th is just 1 week before Congress was set to vote on the resolution of whether Bush should be authorized to go to war. So this is a report on October the 4th. And in this unclassified version, the conclusion of U.S. intelligence that Hussein was not an imminent threat to the security of this country, page 8 of the report, was completely deleted in its entirety from the White Paper. So Congress and the American people never saw any of this. And I think you'll agree, Jeff, it's very, very interesting to speculate what Congress would have done on October the 11th, a week later, when they voted on the resolution of whether Bush can go to war, if they had right in front of them this paragraph, which was the consensus of 16 intelligence agencies that Hussein and Iraq were not imminent threats for the security of this country. So we know, Jeff, not think, but know that Bush and his people, I'm talking about people like, Cheney and Rove and Condoleezza Rice, they took this nation to war on a lie in which 500,000 precious human beings have died horrible, violent deaths. And the question I have is, I guess it's a rhetorical question, how evil, how perverse, how sick, how criminal can Bush and his people be? Yet unbelievably, up to now, they've gotten away with all of this. How's the time situation? I want to get into a couple other pieces of evidence. Are you there?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have about 12 or so minutes left. I know there's some other very compelling evidence in the movie and in your book, one of which is the Manning memo. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
I'm glad you brought that up because that's an extremely important memo that got very little attention at the time in the media. Extremely important. It's irrefutable evidence against Bush. On January 31st, 2003, that's less than 2 months before Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq, on the rationale that Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, so he had to strike first, self-defense, Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair met in the Oval Office with 6 of their top aides, including Blair's chief foreign policy advisor, as you mentioned, David Manning. Now, after the meeting, Manning prepared a 5-page memo stamped, quote, extremely sensitive, unquote, summarizing what was said at the meeting. Among other things, he wrote that Bush was so worried about the failure of the UN inspectors to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, that he talked about 3 possible ways, Manning wrote, and this is Bush's words, to, quote, provoke a confrontation, unquote, with Hussein. One of which Bush said was to fly U-2, that's CIA, fly U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Iraq, Bush said, painted in United Nations colors. And then Bush went on to say if Hussein fired on them, he would be in violation of UN resolutions, and that would justify our going to war with them. So Bush is telling the American people, Jeff, that Hussein is an imminent threat to the security of this country, so we had to strike first, self-defense. But behind closed doors, this very small man, George Bush, was talking about how to provoke Hussein into a war. I don't have to tell you, Jeff, that the last person in the world who someone acting in self-defense would try to provoke is the person he is in deathly fear of, the person who's about to kill him. If Bush honestly believed that Hussein was an imminent threat to the security of this country, which is the main reason he gave for going to war, the very thought of trying to provoke Hussein into a war, if we're going to use logic as governing our thoughts, obviously would never, ever, ever have entered his mind. I just want to bring it, since we talked a little bit about the United Nations thing, I do want to just kind of summarize that and ask for your opinion on it, because I concluded something and I want to see how you feel about it. Between November of 2002 and March of 2003, Hans, that's H-A-N-S, Hans Blix, the UN's chief weapons inspector, and over 100 of his inspectors conducted 731 inspections in Iraq, and they found no weapons of mass destruction. And on March the 7th, 2003, that's less than 2 weeks before Bush invaded Iraq, Blix told the United Nations Security Council, we have this on film, that he and his people were getting proactive cooperation from Hussein, and said, quote, we are able to perform no-notice inspections all over Iraq, unquote. He also said that to absolutely confirm that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction would not take years, but months, and he asked for that additional time. Now, to anyone who wanted to avoid the horror and the bloodshed of a war in Iraq, Blix's words couldn't possibly have been better news. They would have been extremely encouraged by it and wouldn't have dreamed of going to war in 2 weeks. Is our time up?
Oh, no, we have about 6 or 7 minutes left.
Because I hear some music in the background.
Hopefully
okay,
we can take care of that.
Here, let me wrap up this thought, then I want to ask you something.
Sure.
Now, I said if anyone wanted to avoid the war, they'd be very encouraged by Blix's news. Instead, you know what Bush did? He ordered Blix and his inspectors out of Iraq, and he went to war, refusing to grant Blix the time he needed to confirm the absence of weapons of mass destruction. Now, why did he do that? Here's my conclusion, and I'd like to know if you agree with it. I think it's pretty obvious that in a paradoxical way, Blix and his people, Jeff, became Bush's greatest adversaries, because if Blix and his people confirmed that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, this would have robbed Bush of his main argument for war, a war he wanted to fight at all costs. Now, if you have another reasonable explanation for what Bush did, Jeff, I'd like to hear it.
Well, I can't think of it. It seemed as though Hans Blix was on the precipice of determining that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and then there would have been no pretext to go to war. Yeah.
And so Bush got rid of him. Get out, he said. You know, the conduct, Jeff, of Bush and his people in taking this nation to war under false pretenses was so monumentally base, so extraordinarily wrong and dishonorable and criminal that even though I'm, I guess, a writer, I'm not gifted enough as a writer to describe it. I mean, in view of the horrible, incalculable consequences of their act and the greatness of their sin, it would take a Tolstoy, a Shakespeare, a Hemingway to give people a glimpse into the darkness of their souls. It's unbelievable. And the thing that's even more unbelievable is that this country has let them get by with it. You know, they do nothing. All they want to know, did the Dodgers win today? Did the Yankees win today? And you got all these people in their cold graves right now decomposing as I'm talking to you, and no one is fighting to bring about justice for them.
It's really amazing. And, you know, I'm kind of curious if who else's name would be on the indictment? Would it be Bush as well as his cabinet, both Vice President Dick Cheney as well as Condoleezza Rice and everyone? Would they all be on Rumsfeld? Would they be on the indictment as well?
Well, three for sure: Bush, Cheney, and Rice. And then the indictment would say et al., E-T-A-L, meaning there'll be the ones to follow. And then you take the case to the grand jury, and as the evidence comes in, you add people like, if there's evidence to support it, people like Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, people like that. But three for sure is Bush, Cheney, and Rice et al. And I had a prosecutor that was going in the direction, I can't give any guarantee at all, going in the direction of appointing me a special prosecutor in his county to seek a criminal indictment. And I had what they call septic shock. I almost died. I actually flatlined. Now I've got to go to dialysis 3 times a week, so I can't carry the torch anymore. But I'm not saying that he was going to do it, but he was going to come down to my home and spend 6 days with me and go over the evidence, and I would have been able to get an indictment very easily. I mean, you can indict a Hershey bar, but then it would have automatically found its way up to the United States Supreme Court, who would have had the power to prevent it from going forward. And I already had a law school professor preparing all types of legal arguments to rebut what we anticipated Bush and his people would make. The nation would be divided right probably down the middle. The court would take it under submission, and they'd come down with the longest opinion that they'd ever written. But I've been taken out of the ball game. That doesn't mean that I'm not still looking for a prosecutor that has sufficient courage to fight for justice. We hear every day when you live in a big city, and Miami is big enough to have it, not quite like L.A., Chicago, New York, but out here, I'm exaggerating, I say every day, but at least once every 4 or 5 months, we read in the paper that someone back east has been arrested for a murder out here in L.A. that took place 20, 30, 40 years ago. And they call it cold cases. They bring them back and they prosecute them. So you have one victim, one defendant, one killer, and you have a detective that chases this killer to the ends of the earth to bring about justice for just one victim. Here we have over 500,000, and no one is doing anything. This, to me, is the most unbelievable thing.
You know, Vince, we have about a minute left. I just wanted to get your thoughts. If just for people out there, what can they do to raise awareness about this?
Well, one thing, and I'm not trying to make a buck at all, but get that DVD, and if it convinces you that I've got a point, wherever you live in the country, get a group of citizens, go to your local district attorney. That's the most likely person that will prosecute this thing.
Right.
The U.S. attorney's not going to do it because Obama's already said he's out of it.
I'm just going to say we got the music.
The district attorney would have jurisdiction if someone in his county died in the Iraqi war.
We're going to have to leave it at that, Vince. I'd like to give a very special thanks to my guest, Vincent Bugliosi. It's been a pleasure having him on the show. Please tune in next week, Tuesday night, for another edition of Talk Legal. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me on the show. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Vince.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material of this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. The opinions expressed